Welcome to lesson 6.10 for APUS history. We're going to be examining the development of the middle class and just overall how the Industrial Revolution and industrial capitalism changes the class structure within the United States. So essentially, we're going to divide up our social classes into the big three. At the very top, we have our industrial capitalists and our southern planters. These individuals account for about 1% of the U.S. population. However, they're going to hold about 99% plus amount of the wealth in the United States during this time. And then we have our working class that essentially is comprised of unskilled laborers who make up the bulk of our class system during this time. And then we have our middle class, which although it is our second smallest, it is also going to be the social class that is rapidly growing during this time period. So again, this industrial age will shift class systems and who belongs in which class systems. So we'll start at the top here with our industrial capitalists as well as our southern planters. So again, to backtrack, we know that still at this time period, the economy of the North and the South still has very, very different bases. We have an industrial manufacturing northern base, and we have a agricultural southern base where the vast majority of the land is held in the hands of very, very few of these elite and fabulously rich and wealthy southern planters. So, as we had already mentioned, this is the smallest out of these social classes, and these are, your wealthy millionaires and billionaires who overall are going to own all the means of production within the United States. So, in the North, we're talking about, again, these names that are very recognizable, like Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, John Rockefeller. And then again, in the South, we have these individuals who own large plantations. So for these industrial capitalists and southern planters, they're both going to hold a lot of sway over politicians. Many of them spend in one day what many politicians might make in a year or even a lifetime. And so these individuals have a lot of political clout because they're the ones that have the money. The vast majority of them own the means of production within the public sphere. Overall, these are individuals who are white. They are college educated. Even these white women go on to a formal education after high school. They do not go to college. They go to finishing school where they learn how to be, again, this societal edition of the perfect woman. These industrial capitalists and southern planters will have fabulous residences within the cities themselves. They are not going to live in the filth and nastiness next to the factories they own. Instead, there's going to be exclusive gated communities where they will have a city residence. And then they also have a country estate or a country residence where they can escape the filth and grime of the cities. So these industrial capitalists and southern planters, they spend money like there's no tomorrow, and they oftentimes are buying up luxury goods as a way to show off their wealth. So their spending habits are not for survival. Their spending habits are to show how much power and prestige they have. And they often are in competition with each other. So if one industrial capitalist buys this fabulous carriage, and then the other one buys a fabulous carriage that has 20 more diamonds on it than the first one, right? So they are kind of keeping up with the Joneses between them, if you will. Many of these industrial capitalists have their own zoos. Like they don't have to leave their house to go to a zoo. So again, that just shows you what type of wealth is being created during this time period. Many of these Gilded Age mansions are still around. They're preserved as historical sites. I went to one in Minnesota and it had 56 bedrooms. And that was just one of the mansions that was owned by this major Gilded Age industrial capitalist to give you an idea. Now, your southern planters, of course, are going to be a little bit more isolated. They're going to have their large estates. They don't necessarily have another home elsewhere, but they themselves own hundreds of acres, and they stay essentially holed up with their luxury goods on their large plantations. So that brings us to our next class, which is our working class. So this is, again, going to be the largest of our social classes during this time period. This working class is primarily going to be made up of either poor white immigrants, African Americans, individuals who are of Mexican or American Indian descent. And this working class is essentially unskilled laborers. So these are your factory workers that are just floor workers in the industrial north. In the South, these are going to be your sharecroppers or your people who work the land, but of course don't own any of it, are not entitled to the profits of it. So many of these individuals have little to no education whatsoever. Many are illiterate. Others can maybe sign their own name, and that's about it. And without this level of education and without having any trade or any skill, they are paid very, very small, minuscule wages. The working class has a tendency in the North to live right next to the factories in which they work. So that way they can get to their factory work on foot. They don't have any other means of transportation. And these residences are notorious for being essentially slums, and they're full of disease. These are fire traps. There's gambling and alcoholism and prostitution, murder, you name it. It's happening within these working class tenement houses that are next to these factories. In the South, your sharecroppers, of course, are going to live a more isolated existence, but they experience rural poverty where they have a lack of access to medications, running waters, these sorts of things. Your working class is going to have a subsistence living where they're literally living from hand to mouth. Whatever money they make that day at their factory job is spent generally that day on food, clothing, rent, what other necessities. And there is no money left over once the bills are paid. And if the kids are fed, there's nothing left over at the end of the day for entertainment or for fun. So our third and final class is going to be the middle class. And again, this is primarily going to be individuals who take jobs as managers, as accountants, as middlemen. So they're taking advantage of these new opportunities that are being created within industrial America. Again, these are predominantly white men who are going to be in the middle class. Usually they are high school educated, maybe had some college, but are not necessarily college graduates. And these are individuals who are able to move away from the filth and the grime of the inner cities next to the industrial complexes. So they are able to buy, modest but clean homes that are on the outskirts of town, away from the crime and the filth of the slums. And they are also able to afford some type of transportation, such as trolleys or streetcars or subways, and to take these modes of public transportation to go from their homes on the outskirts back into the inner cities to the factories. But then, of course, at the end of the day, they're able to leave the pollution, leave the nastiness, and go back to their residence on the outskirt of the cities themselves. The middle class in the South is essentially unheard of. So the South, you're either going to have your small percentage of individuals who are wealthy planters who own the land, and then the vast majority of Southern society are individuals who are living in rural poverty, who are working the land either as sharecroppers or in other types of contractual arrangements. So the middle class in the North, what they do is they find at the end of the day, once they've paid the bills and fed their kids, that they have extra money left over. And we call this disposable income. It's not enough to, smoke cigars wrapped in $1,000 bills like we saw with our industrial capitalists, but it's enough money for them to find entertainment and to find leisure. Many of them, again, in the middle class, are able to hire domestic workers, people to take care of the household duties. So now they have money and they have time. So we do see an increase in the attendance and the popularity of professional sports during this time. Also, theaters become widely popular, vaudeville or live shows, and eventually we'll have motion pictures that will replace those within the theaters themselves. Vacation, travel, all of these types of things become popular during this time period. So your middle class men, as we mentioned, are working in the public sphere as clerics, as accountants, etc. So what are your middle class women doing during this time? Interesting enough, they're actually entering the public sphere themselves, which seems totally contrary to the idea of the cult of domesticity, where a woman's place is as a support structure, a meek individual who's at home. They're entering the public sphere, but married women in particular, not as workers. They're entering the public sphere as reformers. They're individuals who see what's happening in the slums. They see what's happening in the inner cities, and they want something to be done about it. This is, believe it or not, seen as appropriate during this time period. Women as reformers were seen as nurturers. And rather than nurturing the children and the husband within the home, they were out nurturing society. So women within the public sphere as reformers, this was seen as a natural extension, if you will, of the cult of domesticity.